You know, there's a kind of peace that only comes from being surrounded by nature. The smell of pine in the morning air, the shimmer of sunlight over still, lake water, and the kind of silence that makes you feel human again. For me, that peace came from my cabin, a small hand-built hideaway tucked on the edge of Maple Ridge Lake. It wasn't fancy or luxurious, but it was mine. Every log, every nail, every piece of it was built with my own 2 hands. It was a sanctuary, the one place where the chaos of the modern world couldn't reach me. And then one morning, the HOA showed up. They didn't call, didn't knock, didn't even send a letter. They arrived in a little convoy of SUVs, like they were descending on a crime scene. 3 people stepped out wearing neon vests and carrying clipboards, their faces already twisted with disapproval. Leading the pack was a man named Martin Caldwell, HOA president, part-time realtor, and full-time pain in the neck. Martin had this smug look about him, the kind of look people wear when they think rules make them powerful. He stood in front of my cabin, squinting like he'd just spotted something illegal. Then he looked at me and said, "Mr. Landry, this structure is unauthorized. It violates Section 8, Article 14 of the Community Code. You've got 72 hours to demolish it." I stared at him for a moment, half expecting a hidden camera to pop out from behind the trees. "You're joking, right?" I asked. But Martin didn't smile. "You should have read your neighbor agreement," he said flatly. "Your land borders association property, which means you're subject to aesthetic compliance. The board voted unanimously. You've got 72 hours before we report you to the county." That was when I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so incredibly stupid. The man was standing there, quoting bylaws, completely unaware that he was trying to boss me around on my own property. My cabin wasn't on HOA land. It sat on the one piece of lakefront property that wasn't part of their little domain. I'd owned it for years, and before me, my father had owned it. The HOA had tried to buy it several times, offering lowball prices and making claims that my cabin was an eyesore to their perfect little community. But I always refused. It wasn't an eyesore. It was character. It was freedom. And it was mine. As they walked around taking pictures and muttering about violations, I stood there quietly, letting them feel important. But inside, I was already thinking 3 steps ahead, because what Martin didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my family's connection to this land went much deeper than they realized. See, my grandfather bought this property over 40 years ago, long before the HOA even existed. Back then, Maple Ridge was nothing but open land, a lake, and a few old fishing shacks. When the HOA formed and built their clubhouse, tennis courts, and parking lot, they did it on land they didn't actually own. They leased it from my grandfather, and when he passed, that lease passed down to my father, and then to me. So when Martin strutted up to my cabin, barking orders and waving his clipboard, he was standing on my grandfather's lease. That lease was due for renewal next month, and I hadn't given it much thought. Until now. Suddenly, it seemed like the perfect time to give it a little update. That night, I sat in my cabin with the fire crackling in the hearth, the scent of wood smoke filling the room, and a mug of coffee cooling in my hands. I pulled out the old lease papers and read them over. The HOA was paying $500 a year for the land their entire clubhouse and tennis courts sat on. $500. They'd gotten away with that rate for 20 years. But times change. I called my lawyer, an old friend named Rick Stanton, a man who loved 2 things: barbecue and watching arrogant HOA boards collapse under their own rules. When I told him what had happened, he whistled through his teeth and said, "They gave you 72 hours on your land." Oh, they're gonna regret that. We spent the next 2 days working on the new lease. The terms were simple. The rent would now reflect current market value. Instead of $500 a year, the HOA would pay $4,500 a month, and if they didn't like it, the agreement gave me the right to terminate their lease entirely with 30 days' notice, which meant their precious clubhouse, their tennis courts, and even their parking lot could all legally become off-limits. But I wasn't done, because revenge, real revenge, isn't just about payback. It's about timing. So I waited. I waited until the HOA called their monthly meeting, the same one where they planned to finalize my demolition order. When I walked into that meeting, every head in the room turned. Martin looked up from his stack of papers, eyebrows raised. "Mr. Landry, we weren't expecting you." "I know," I said, walking to the front of the table. "I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page before that 72-hour deadline runs out." I set a manila folder on the table and slid it toward him. He opened it, and I watched the color drain from his face. The rest of the board leaned in, whispering, eyes widening as they read the new lease agreement. I leaned back, folded my arms, and smiled. "If you're going to tell me what to do with my property," I said, "you might want to start paying rent on yours." The room went silent. Martin's pen slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. Nobody said a word. And that was just the beginning. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. The kind of silence that only happens when people suddenly realize they've been standing on thin ice all along. Martin's face had turned an interesting shade of pale pink. The kind you only get when your world starts crumbling in slow motion. He looked at me like I'd just spoken another language, blinking, flipping through the papers, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. $4,500 a month, he finally stammered. "This has to be a mistake." "No mistake," I said calmly. "That's the current market rate for lakeside commercial property. You've been getting a good deal for the last 20 years, but times change." He glanced at the other board members for support, but no one was meeting his eyes. They all just sat there, whispering, scanning the papers. I could see the gears turning in their heads, trying to figure out how they'd explain this to the rest of the community. Finally, one of them, a woman named Denise, who always acted like the voice of reason, cleared her throat. "Mr. Landry, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." I smiled. "There's no misunderstanding, Denise. The HOA's lease on that land expires next month. You have 30 days to either agree to the new terms or vacate the premises. Oh, and just for clarity, the clubhouse, tennis courts, and parking lot all sit on that property. So, technically, those areas belong to me." Martin slammed his hand on the table. "You can't do this. We've been here for years." "That's true," I said, nodding. "And I've been patient for years. But then you decided to give me 72 hours to demolish my cabin. So, I figured we should all get a taste of urgency." The look on his face was priceless. He didn't know whether to yell or beg. I gathered my folder, gave them a polite nod, and walked out. The whole board sat there in stunned silence as I left. Their perfect little meeting shattered. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on the porch of my cabin, looking out over the water. The sunset painted the lake orange and gold, and for the first time that week, I felt completely at peace. But I knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The HOA wasn't going to just roll over. Martin's ego wouldn't let him. He'd come back swinging, and I was ready for it. Sure enough, the next morning, I found an envelope taped to my cabin door. It was from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice claiming that my new lease terms were unreasonable and not legally enforceable. They demanded a fair negotiation and threatened to file an injunction if I didn't comply. I couldn't help but laugh. They were so used to bullying homeowners that they couldn't comprehend someone having actual leverage over them. I forwarded the letter to Rick, my lawyer, and within hours, he called me back, chuckling. "They're bluffing," he said, completely toothless. "You're the legal landowner, and the lease gives you full authority to adjust rates or terminate. "You've got them boxed in, my friend," I grinned. "Then let's tighten the box." Over the next few days, things got interesting. The HOA started sending out community emails, trying to rally support. Martin painted me as the greedy landowner trying to extort the neighborhood. They held emergency meetings, tried to pressure county officials, and even hinted at taking me to court. But every time they tried to fight, Rick and I were 2 steps ahead. We sent them official notices of the new rent terms, complete with documentation showing that similar lakefront properties in the area went for even more than what I was charging. We copied the county clerk on everything, just to make sure the paper trail was solid. Then came the best part. Rick found an old clause buried in the original lease, one that allowed the landowner, me, to collect late payment penalties of 10% per month on overdue rent. The HOA had been late on their last 2 payments, which meant they already owed me extra. I drafted a short letter and had it hand-delivered to the HOA office. It read, "Dear Maple Ridge HOA, as of today, your lease renewal terms remain unsigned, and your existing lease payments are overdue. Please be advised that continued occupancy of the leased property without compliance constitutes trespassing under County Code. You have 14 days to remedy the situation. Sincerely, J. Landry, property owner." 2 days later, Martin showed up at my door again. He wasn't wearing his usual smug grin this time. He looked tired, nervous even. "Can we talk?" he asked. I motioned toward the porch chairs. "Sure, but I'll warn you now, I don't negotiate on empty stomachs." I handed him a cup of coffee and sat across from him. He took a sip, sighed, and said, "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. The HOA was just enforcing the rules. You can't expect us to." "Martin," I interrupted, "you gave me 72 hours to destroy something I built with my own hands. You didn't ask, you didn't check the property line, and you didn't care. Now you're sitting in a chair that's technically on my land, drinking coffee on the deck you wanted demolished. Do you see the irony?" He didn't say anything, just stared down at his cup. "I'm not trying to ruin anyone's lives," I continued, "but I'm done being pushed around. The HOA's going to pay what the land's worth, or it's going to find somewhere else to host its meetings." He nodded slowly, clearly realizing he didn't have a leg to stand on. "I'll talk to the board," he said finally. "You do that," I replied. "You've got 12 days left." As he walked away, I couldn't help but smile. I knew exactly how this was going to play out. They'd fight, they'd threaten, they'd scramble, but in the end, they'd cave. They had no other choice. And the best part? This was only phase 1 of my plan. They thought they were dealing with a stubborn homeowner. They had no idea I was about to flip the entire HOA on its head, legally, financially, and publicly. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't destroying something. It's owning everything they think they control. The board scrambled, like people who finally noticed the ceiling was on fire, but hadn't bothered to check the fuse box. Emails flew. Phone calls cascaded into voicemail, and a rumor mill that normally hummed at a polite volume began grinding into overdrive. Martin called emergency meetings. Denise tried to calm the membership with a carefully worded bulletin, and a handful of disgruntled homeowners who'd always enjoyed the clubhouse barbecues started whispering about the unreasonable landowner and lost community values. It was delicious. The louder they yelled about community, the more obvious it became that their community hinged on a lease that, until last week, they treated like an afterthought. They tried the legal route first, because that's what people do when they think money and paperwork can solve everything. Threatened injunctions, vague hints about county codes, and 2 rushed consultations with an attorney who mostly did wills and small business contracts each time they threatened court. Rick and I sent a polite counter. copies of the original lease, county assessor maps showing the parcel boundaries, and a tidy spreadsheet proving the market comparables. Every legal threat they waved at me turned out to be a paper boat in a rainstorm. It wilted under inspection. The more they leaned into threats, the clearer it became that their power was performative. A parade of bylaws and fines that only carried weight when other people believed they did. While they were publicly posturing, I started pulling together the quieter pieces of the plan: transparency, optics, and pressure from the right directions. The HOA's power lived off two things: secrecy and inertia. Take those away and it toppled like a house of cards. So I did three things at once. First, I printed a short, elegant packet of documents: deed history, lease terms, photographs showing property lines, and a straightforward explanation of the new lease terms. And dropped them in every mailbox on Maple Ridge. No legalese, no threats, just facts. Second, I invited the neighborhood journalists, the small town paper that covered dog shows and ribbon cuttings, and a regional blogger who loved digging into local governance. Third, I scheduled a public meeting at the cabin, not a showdown, an open, neighborly, let's talk, where anyone curious could come see the land that had been in my family for decades. The response surprised even me. People showed up. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they'd always liked the idea of a private lake and a small clubhouse, but were wary of the board's drama. A few older residents who'd been around when my grandfather first bought the property came with photos in their hands and a soft kind of nostalgia. They remembered when the place was undeveloped, when the clubhouse was just a shingled shed, and the HOA started as a group that organized fishing derbies. They listened while I explained the lease renewal, the math, and the timeline. I made sure everything was clear and digestible. Here's the past, here's today, and here are the options. No shouting, no chest thumping, just the truth laid out plainly. The media helped. The local paper ran a piece that framed the dispute as a lakeside standoff over old leases and community access. The blogger published a detailed post showing copies of the lease and a map with parcel lines highlighted. Suddenly, the issue stopped being internal HOA drama and started being a story about transparency, fairness, and a community's relationship with its own public spaces. The more the story circulated, the more homeowners began to ask uncomfortable questions at their own meetings. Why didn't we know the HOA didn't own the land under the clubhouse? When did we stop paying attention? Who signed those backdated checks? Martin hit back the only way he knew how, with indignation and optics. He organized a town hall of his own, renting a conference room, and inviting the same journalists, trying to frame me as aggressive and destabilizing. He waved around bylaws and printed board resolutions like a magician's props, hoping the audience would be wowed into submission. But the moment he raised his voice and waved his clipboard, people remembered the packet in their hands and the map pinned to the wall at my cabin. Facts have a funny habit of cooling righteous anger. Martin's performance looked to the public like someone panicked and reached for authority. That didn't play well. Behind the scenes, negotiations took on a peculiar rhythm. The HOA board, now under pressure from members who had read the paper, wanted to avoid an expensive legal fight and a public spectacle that might hurt property values. Martin wanted to save face. Denise wanted a compromise that would keep the clubhouse functional. I wanted a fair market rate and assurances that the association would honor the lease moving forward. So we began a series of talks, mediated by Rick, that were bland on paper but intense in practice. I made it clear, either negotiate in good faith or vacate. The new rent I'd proposed was high enough to matter, but not ruinous. It was a test. Would they value their clubhouse enough to meet market realities? Over the course of a week, the HOA's finances leaked into public view in a way no one had expected. Board members who'd never thought about budgets suddenly had to justify the cost of maintaining a facility they didn't technically own. Conversations about community fees turned into arguments about transparency and fiduciary responsibility. Members demanded audits. Some suggested putting the clubhouse on a separate property fund. Others wondered if the HOA could buy the land outright. The more they panicked, the more options they considered that previously felt inconvenient or expensive. Precisely the kind of thinking that happens when something you took for granted is suddenly at risk. Then came the leverage moment. One rainy afternoon, I called a special meeting and invited every homeowner to the lake for a public vote. Either the HOA could accept the new market rent terms for the land under the clubhouse, or the HOA would be given 30 days' notice to vacate and the land would revert to private use. The wording was strategic. It didn't say remove clubhouse. It said vacate. Ownership and access were subtly, legally distinct. And I wanted the choice in the community's hands, rather than in a courthouse. Would they preserve the clubhouse at a fair price, or would they walk away and try to build elsewhere? At the meeting, the air smelled like wet earth and anticipation. Martin spoke first, trying to rally the faithful with talk of community values and precedent. He called me a crook. He called me reckless. He even tried to make the argument that my new rates would push dues higher. But his words landed with the same hollow thump they'd always had now. That the numbers were on the table and the history was clear. People who'd been content to let the board run things in the past raised their hands and asked pointed, practical questions. How much would this cost per household? What alternatives do we have? What happens if we lose the clubhouse? When the figures were spelled out, a modest increase spread across the full membership versus the uncertainty and expense of litigating or relocating the clubhouse. The choice became obvious to most. The vote wasn't a landslide, but it was decisive. A majority chose to approve the lease renewal at market rate. The HOA had a legal route to stay put if it honoured the new terms. Martin looked deflated, like a storm cloud losing its edge. Yet even as one pressure valve released, other things tightened. A few die-hard traditionalists vowed to sue, convinced they'd been betrayed. A couple of younger members suggested using this moment to democratize the HOA board, pushing for elected transparency and term limits. The clubhouse would remain, for now. But the culture had shifted. People began asking for more oversight, quarterly financial reports, and clearer lines between volunteer leaders and the association's fiduciary responsibilities. Walking back to my cabin after the meeting, twilight pooling around the lake, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumphalism. It was the satisfaction of rights acknowledged, and a community nudged toward accountability. I also knew the story wasn't finished. Martin would lick his wounds, regroup, and look for ways to reclaim power in committees and whisper campaigns. Some resentments would simmer. Legal threats would linger at the edges. But the crucial thing had happened. The narrative had changed from a man trying to bully the HOA to an owner asking for fair treatment and transparency. And that, more than anything, had shifted the leverage permanently. As the 30-day clock continued to tick on the paperwork, I started planning the next phase. Not to punish the HOA, but to cement a new equilibrium. That meant drafting clear payment schedules, proposing an escrow arrangement for late payments, and outlining a community use agreement that protected residents' access, while also ensuring my rights as the landowner. It also meant being ready for the board's next move. Whether they tried to placate the membership or quietly conspired to find technical loopholes, which is why, in the weeks that followed, I kept my eyes open, my paperwork ready, and my neighborly invitations frequent. Because sometimes, winning isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of the part where you make sure the lesson sticks. When the board finally signed the new lease, the ink didn't just dry, it sank. You could feel the shift in every corner of Maple Ridge. For years, the HOA had operated like a small-town monarchy, untouchable and unquestioned. But now, they were tenants. My tenants. The document was straightforward. 4 pages, no loopholes, no fine print. They would pay market rent for the land their clubhouse, tennis courts, and parking lot occupied. Payments were due on the 1st of every month, with a late fee after 5 days. It was clean, professional, and most importantly, ironclad. Rick, my lawyer, leaned back in his chair as we reviewed the final copy. "You know, you could have doubled it instead of tripling," he said with a grin. "But I like your style." I smirked. Tripling gets their attention, and it did. The next HOA newsletter was practically a novel, filled with cautious explanations about necessary adjustments to community dues and unexpected changes in land costs. Martin tried to spin it as a restructured community agreement rather than a defeat, but everyone saw through it. Homeowners started gossiping, laughing quietly when they saw him in public. The man who once strutted through the neighborhood quoting bylaws now avoided eye contact like a kid who got caught cheating on a test. At first, I thought that would be the end of it. They'd pay the rent, lick their wounds, and life would move on. But if I'd learned anything about HOAs, it's that pride doesn't die easily. It festers. A few weeks later, I noticed the first sign. A bright orange notice taped to my cabin door. Violation, unauthorized structure, adjacent to community pathway. They were trying again. It would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. The community pathway they were referring to was a gravel trail that ran next to my property line, but stopped 10 feet short of it. Still, they claimed my porch visually encroached on the aesthetic flow of the path. That word, aesthetic, was Martin's favorite weapon. He'd used it to fine people for garden gnomes, mailbox colors, even for leaving trash cans visible for more than 12 minutes after pickup day. I took the notice down, folded it neatly, and slipped it into an envelope addressed to Rick. He called me that evening, laughing so hard he had to catch his breath. "They really don't learn, do they?" "Oh, they're learning," I said. "Just not fast enough." Rick drafted a cease and desist letter citing harassment and abuse of authority under state HOA statutes. The next day, we hand-delivered it to the HOA office, along with a copy to the County Housing Board. The clerk at the county's compliance office knew me by now and gave a knowing smile as she stamped the paperwork. "These HOA folks sure like to play games," she said. "Yeah," I replied, "and they keep losing." That week, something else started happening. Homeowners, people I barely knew, began stopping by my cabin. Some came to apologize for the way the HOA had treated me. Others just wanted to thank me for standing up to them. A retired couple brought me a basket of homemade muffins. A young dad came by to say he'd been fined $200 for leaving a kayak on his own lawn, and he was glad someone finally took those clowns down a peg. It hit me then. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. The HOA had built an empire of fear, nickel and diming people into quiet resentment. My fight had cracked the foundation, and everyone else was peeking through the gap. A few weeks later, I got an invitation, ironically, from the HOA itself. They were calling for a special election meeting to discuss board leadership restructuring. Translation: Martin's throne was wobbling. I couldn't resist showing up. The meeting was held in the clubhouse. the same one sitting on my land. I arrived early, mostly out of curiosity. People filled the room slowly, murmuring, clutching printed agendas. Martin was already at the front, looking pale and tired. Denise sat beside him, her expression stiff, but not unfriendly. When the meeting started, Martin cleared his throat and tried to sound calm. We've gathered today to address some of the challenges the board has faced in recent months. It's been a difficult time for everyone, someone from the back called out. Yeah, especially for the guy whose cabin you tried to demolish. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Martin's jaw tightened. Denise stepped in. Let's try to stay civil, please. We're here to discuss leadership changes. A man named Harold, a soft-spoken retiree who'd lived in Maple Ridge since before the HOA even formed, stood up. I moved to remove the current president from his position. Effective immediately, the room broke into applause. Martin's face went crimson. He stammered something about procedure, but it didn't matter. A quick show of hands sealed his fate. The vote wasn't even close. And just like that, Martin Caldwell, the man who gave me 72 hours to demolish my cabin, was no longer HOA president. After the meeting, Denise approached me. You know, she said quietly, he brought most of this on himself. He couldn't let it go. I know, I replied. Some people mistake authority for ownership, she sighed. We'll get things back on track. I promise. I nodded, and for the first time, I actually believed her. Denise was firm but fair. Someone who understood that rules weren't meant to control people, just guide them. Over the next few weeks, things started to settle. The new board stopped sending passive-aggressive letters. They even sent a maintenance crew to fix a pothole near my driveway, something Martin's board had ignored for years. I didn't ask for it, but I appreciated the gesture. But of course, peace never lasts long in a neighborhood where power is currency. Because while the board was trying to repair its image, Martin was quietly working on something else. Rumor had it, he'd teamed up with a few of his old allies and was planning a lawsuit. Something about unfair land leasing practices and extortion through property control. I wasn't surprised. Martin was too proud to disappear quietly. And if he wanted a fight, I was more than ready for round 2. Because I wasn't just going to defend myself this time. I was going to make sure that man never held a clipboard again. And as it turned out, that revenge was about to go viral. You'd think after being voted out in front of the entire neighborhood, Martin would have taken the loss and moved on. Maybe he'd spend more time mowing his perfectly square lawn or writing angry letters to the editor about fence heights. But no, he came back swinging. About a month after the leadership change, I received a thick envelope from an unfamiliar law firm. The sender, Caldwell & Associates versus Pierce Land Holdings, LLC. Yep. Martin had filed a lawsuit. He was claiming that my land lease agreement with the HOA was predatory, that I'd exploited a position of financial control to impose unreasonable terms, and that the entire deal should be voided on grounds of community coercion. I nearly laughed out loud when I read that. Community coercion. This from the guy who once fined a neighbor for having a non-conforming mailbox flag. Rick, my lawyer, called it what it was, grasping at straws. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on, he said, flipping through the pages. The land titles are clear. The lease was negotiated and signed voluntarily by the HOA board. He's trying to use emotion where there's no law to back it. Yeah, I said, but emotion's his game. He's hoping to stir up drama. Rick smiled. Then let's give him more than he can handle. We filed a counterclaim almost immediately, not just for defamation and harassment, but for unpaid property maintenance fees the HOA owed me since the lease began, plus damages for the attempted demolition order. If Martin wanted a war, I was going to bring the kind that ends careers. Word spread fast. The lawsuit became the neighborhood's hottest gossip. Every morning, the community Facebook group lit up with new posts, screenshots, rumors, heated debates. Some supported me, others thought I'd gone too far. But everyone agreed on one thing: Martin had picked the wrong fight. Then came the kicker. During discovery, Rick uncovered something in the HOA's records, an expense report from 6 months earlier that didn't add up. It showed a maintenance reimbursement of $14,200 to a company called Clearview Improvements, LLC, only there was no record of any actual work done, no receipts, no invoices, just a payment authorization signed by none other than Martin Caldwell. Rick raised an eyebrow when he showed me. "You know what this is?" "Kickback," I said. "Classic." We quietly filed it as part of our evidence. I didn't even have to say a word. The documents spoke for themselves. The HOA's new treasurer, Denise, was furious when she found out. She called an emergency board meeting, and within 48 hours, Martin was banned from all HOA property. His lawsuit was suddenly looking a lot more like a cover-up. But I wasn't done yet. See, I'd been recording the entire saga since day one. Every letter, every notice, every conversation I'd had with the HOA was documented. And I realized something. This wasn't just a local story anymore. It was the perfect modern-day David versus Goliath tale. So I did what any smart man with receipts would do. I made a video. I sat on my cabin porch, camera rolling, and told the story from the very beginning. The illegal demolition threat, the land records, the rent increase, the lawsuit, everything. I even showed a few of the official documents with personal info blurred out. No drama, no shouting, just facts, told calmly with a touch of dry humor. The title: HOA tried to bully me, then found out they rent their own clubhouse from me. I uploaded it one Friday evening, closed my laptop, and didn't think much of it. But by Sunday morning, my phone was buzzing non-stop. The video had exploded. Hundreds of thousands of views, tens of thousands of comments, and shares across every platform imaginable. People loved it. They called it the most satisfying revenge story ever. Memes popped up, edits circulated, and someone even made a remix using Martin's voice from a leaked meeting recording. Overnight, I went from quiet landowner to a minor internet celebrity, and as the views skyrocketed, so did the pressure on Martin. News outlets started calling the HOA for comment. Local reporters showed up at Maple Ridge asking for interviews. The story had grown legs, and Martin couldn't run fast enough. A week later, he quietly withdrew his lawsuit. Just like that. No statement, no apology, no public defense. He simply vanished from the conversation. Rumor had it he sold his house within a month and moved to another county. But his departure left behind something unexpected: peace. The HOA, under Denise's leadership, started changing its tone entirely. The newsletters became friendlier. The rules were relaxed. People actually smiled at meetings. One neighbor even joked that my cabin should be declared a historical landmark, the birthplace of the HOA rebellion. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy that title. Still, I didn't forget how close they'd come to destroying something I loved. I knew that power, once tasted, always has a way of creeping back in. So, I decided to make sure it couldn't. I bought more land, every surrounding acre I could legally acquire that bordered Maple Ridge. Every path, easement, and parcel became mine. Quietly, through shell companies and patient negotiation, I expanded my ownership until the HOA's property was completely surrounded. Rick called it a legal moat. I called it peace of mind. Because now, if anyone ever thought about pulling another demolition stunt, they'd have to cross my land first. And they'd be paying triple rent for the privilege. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. Because something was coming I didn't expect. Something that would turn this local feud into a nationwide movement. And it all started with a single email from a stranger who wanted to tell me their own HOA horror story. The email came in on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the air smells like pine and the lake sits perfectly still. I was sitting on my porch, coffee in hand, trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace. But when I opened my inbox, there it was. Subject line: "They did the same thing to me." It was from a guy named Tom Reynolds, a retired firefighter from Arizona. He'd watched my video and wanted to share his own story. How his HOA fined him for building a small wheelchair ramp for his wife, who had recently suffered a stroke. They claimed it disrupted the neighborhood's uniform front design. When he refused to remove it, they started piling on penalties until he nearly lost his home. His message ended with, "I wish I'd had your courage to fight back. You gave me hope that maybe someone like me can stand up to them too." I sat there reading it over and over. It hit me harder than I expected. What started as my personal revenge story was suddenly something bigger. My little feud had turned into a spark, and that spark was catching. Over the next week, my inbox flooded. Hundreds of messages, then thousands. People from all over the country, Florida, Texas, Oregon, even Alaska, sharing their own HOA horror stories, unfair fines, illegal foreclosures, harassment over paint colors and mailboxes. It was like peeling back a national secret everyone had been too afraid to talk about. And here's the thing. I didn't just get sympathy emails. I got proof. Photos, documents, letters, videos, evidence of HOA boards abusing power in every way imaginable. I realized this wasn't just drama. This was a systemic issue. So, I made another video. This one wasn't about me. It was about them, the people who'd reached out, the voices who'd been silenced or ignored. I called it HOA Horror Stories, the truth behind the gates. I narrated their stories one by one, changing names for privacy, showing clips of neighborhoods that looked almost identical to mine. I talked about how HOAs were meant to protect property values, but had become mini dictatorships, where ordinary homeowners were treated like tenants in their own houses. The video blew up even faster than the first. News channels picked it up. Podcasters called it the Great HOA Awakening. The comment sections were a flood of rage, solidarity, and stories of people finally standing up to their boards. A week later, I was on the phone with a producer from a major news network. They wanted to do a feature segment titled The HOA Backlash, When Homeowners Say Enough. Martin would be losing his mind if he saw this. I told Rick. He laughed. Oh, he's seeing it. You just turned his little empire into a nationwide revolt, and he wasn't wrong. Across the country, HOAs were getting bombarded with questions from homeowners, suddenly armed with information. People started requesting audits, reviewing financials, calling out corruption, demanding accountability. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. A real estate investment firm reached out to me. Big one, national level. They'd seen my story and wanted to partner on a new project. A network of HOA-free communities. Neighborhoods built on transparency, shared ownership, and fair maintenance contributions. Not control or intimidation. They offered to fund the pilot program on one condition. I'd serve as the public face. At first, I laughed it off. I was a guy with a cabin by a lake, not a public speaker. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If people trusted my story, maybe they'd trust the vision too. Maybe I could turn one act of revenge into something that actually changed things. Rick handled the legal side, while I handled the messaging. We named it the Open Gate Initiative. The slogan was simple: community without control, When we launched, the response was insane. Thousands signed up for updates. Investors backed it. Homeowners volunteered to help start chapters. Local news turned into national coverage. And before I knew it, I was standing in front of a camera again, this time on a talk show, explaining how it all began with one arrogant HOA president who tried to tear down my cabin. I remember what the host said to me after the show ended. He leaned in and whispered, "You know, you might have just started a movement. Maybe I had. But success has a way of drawing shadows back out of the dark. Because about a month later, when everything was rolling smoothly, I got a certified letter. No name, no return address, just a stamp and my name printed in all caps. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No threats, no legal jargon, just 5 words. You think you've won. Martin hasn't left." I stared at it for a long time. My first instinct was to laugh. Another scare tactic, probably. But deep down, I felt that old chill creep back. Martin Caldwell had gone quiet for a reason. And if I knew him at all, silence wasn't surrender. It was set up. I looked out across the lake, the water rippling under the afternoon sun. And I had a feeling this wasn't over. Because revenge stories rarely end where you think they do. Sometimes, the villain just changes the script. For the first time in months, I felt the kind of unease that doesn't come from noise. It comes from silence. That single line, "You think you've won. Martin hasn't left," echoed in my head long after I'd read it. There was no signature, no fingerprints, no return address. Just those 5 words. Typed in a clean, serif font, on crisp white paper. Rick told me not to worry. Could be one of his old allies trying to stir you up. "You've made a lot of enemies in the HOA world," he said with a smirk. He wasn't wrong. Ever since the story went viral, I'd been getting all sorts of messages. Most positive, a few. Not so much. Angry board members. Anonymous threats. People who thought I'd ruined community order. But something about that letter felt different. It wasn't angry. It was confident. Then strange things started happening. First, my mailbox was knocked off its post one night. A prank, maybe. Then, a week later, my security cameras went offline for an hour in the middle of the night. The footage came back corrupted. A few days after that, one of my tires was slashed while I was parked near the local grocery store. Coincidence? Maybe. But I'd learned long ago not to believe too much in coincidence when it came to people like Martin. I decided to get ahead of it. I upgraded my security system, thermal cameras, motion sensors, new lighting, even a drone setup with night surveillance. Overkill, perhaps. But if someone was trying to rattle me, they'd soon realize I wasn't that easy to shake. Then came the next blow. This one digital. One morning Rick called me, sounding alarmed. "Hey, your company's website, Pierce Land Holdings, it's been hacked." I froze. Hacked? How bad? "Bad," he said. The homepage was replaced with some kind of message. Corporate greed, masquerading as community justice. Then it linked to a blog post claiming you used the HOA lawsuit and viral fame to buy out middle-class neighborhoods for profit. I felt my stomach twist. "What? That's not true." "I know," Rick replied. "But the internet doesn't care about truth when outrage gets clicks." Within hours, the story was spreading. Fake screenshots, edited documents, people calling me a corporate wolf in sheep's clothing. The Open Gate Initiative's page started getting bombarded with angry comments. Investors called, panicked. The press wanted statements. It was like a digital ambush. Fast, precise, and personal. That night, I sat in my cabin, scrolling through the chaos on my phone. Every post, every comment, it all had the same rhythm, the same language style. Short, sharp sentences, repeated phrases, coordinated. Someone was orchestrating this, and I had a pretty good guess who. Martin had always been methodical. He wasn't the type to storm your door. He'd rather poison the well and let you drink from it, so I did what he wouldn't expect. I stayed silent. I didn't defend myself publicly, didn't post rebuttals, or make another video. I just gathered evidence. Rick and I traced the blog's registration details. They were masked, of course, but one clue slipped through. A payment record to a shell company based in a neighboring county. After a week of digging, we found the real owner, Caldwell Consulting, LLC. My jaw clenched when Rick said the name. Martin had started a consulting firm, not for real estate or law, but for HOA restructuring services. His tagline, restoring order to divided communities. It was almost poetic. The man who lost everything because he couldn't control one community had reinvented himself as a consultant, helping others tighten their grip and, worse, he'd been recruiting old HOA board members from across the state, the ones who'd lost power after my story blew up. They were his new clients, and their goal was simple: discredit me, destroy the Open Gate initiative, and restore HOA's image as necessary neighborhood governance. He wasn't just after revenge. He was trying to erase everything I'd built. I realized then, this wasn't a feud anymore. It was a war of influence. And in this kind of war, reputation was the only currency that mattered. So, I went back to what started it all, the truth. I gathered every piece of evidence I had. The demolition order, the lease agreements, the fake blog posts, even Martin's fraudulent HOA payment records. I compiled everything into one massive file and handed it to a journalist I trusted, the same one who'd first covered my story months earlier. We spent days verifying everything, cross-checking, confirming, digging deeper, and when the article went live, it hit harder than I expected. Headline: Former HOA president behind smear campaign against whistleblower landowner. The expose dismantled Martin's new operation piece by piece. Emails, shell accounts, financial ties. It was all there. The man who'd once prided himself on order had orchestrated one of the most chaotic misinformation campaigns the community world had ever seen. By the next morning, his consulting website was gone. The blog disappeared. Investors who'd backed him pulled out. But here's the thing. I didn't feel triumphant. Not this time. The war had cost too much. My reputation was scarred. My inbox flooded with both praise and hate. And every time I stepped outside, I wondered who might be watching. Still, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about protection. About making sure no one else ever went through what I did. So I decided to do something bold, something that would either save everything or end it all. I announced a live town hall, broadcasted online, a face-to-face conversation with anyone, supporters, critics, HOA members, whoever wanted to talk. No scripts, no editing, just me, the truth, and the people. Rick thought I was crazy. You're giving them a platform, he warned. Maybe, I said. But I'm also giving them a mirror. Because sometimes, the only way to fight lies is to drag them into the light and watch who blinks first. The date was set. The cameras were ready. The countdown began, and as the day approached, I couldn't shake one thought. If Martin was still out there, he wouldn't miss this for the world. The morning of the town hall, the air felt heavier than usual. Even the lake seemed still, as if it was holding its breath. I'd slept maybe 3 hours, replaying every possible scenario in my head. What if someone hijacked the feed? What if it turned into chaos? What if Martin showed up? But I knew I couldn't back down. This wasn't about defending myself anymore. It was about defending the idea that ordinary people could stand up to the kind of petty tyranny that had taken root behind gated entrances and manicured lawns. We set up the event inside the old community clubhouse. Yes, their clubhouse. now leased from me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Rick and a few volunteers helped with the tech setup, 2 cameras, 1 mic, and a laptop streaming live to YouTube and Facebook simultaneously. Within the first 10 minutes of going live, over 50,000 people had tuned in. I started with calm honesty. Most of you know me as the guy who fought his HOA and made them pay rent. But what you don't know, I said, looking into the camera, is how deep these battles really go. How people have been silenced, threatened, and manipulated, all for the sake of power. The comments flew faster than I could read them. Preach! This man's a legend, and my HOA fined me for having sunflowers. I'm crying right now. Then came the other side. You're just a greedy landowner. You're no better than the HOAs you hate. Martin was right. That last one caught my eye. I almost ignored it until I saw the username. Us Caldwell, consulting official. For a second, my chest tightened. My mind went blank, but I forced myself to breathe. It had to be fake. A troll account. There was no way Martin would. Then the notification popped up on screen. I Caldwell Consulting Official has joined the live stream. And a video feed appeared. There he was, Martin Caldwell, sitting in a dimly lit office, wearing a grey suit that looked a size too big. Face pale, but eyes sharp. His smile was the same smug curve I'd seen the day he'd handed me the demolition order. Well, well, he began, voice dripping with satisfaction. The hero of the internet, the man who saved the people from the evil HOA. Quite a story you've spun, Pierce. The chat exploded. Thousands of comments flying by. It's him. Oh my God, this is wild. This feels like a movie. I steadied my voice. Martin, I was wondering when you'd crawl out of whatever hole you've been hiding in. He chuckled. You think you won because you made a few YouTube videos. Because you humiliated a board of volunteers trying to maintain order. You're a fraud. You've poisoned communities across the country with your anti-HOA rhetoric. I could feel the tension through the screen. Rick whispered from behind the camera. Don't take the bait, but I wasn't taking it. I was setting it. Martin, I said, let's make something clear. I didn't poison anything. I just exposed what was already rotten. You, for instance. The same man who signed off on fake maintenance payments and tried to demolish private property. You don't get to preach about order, he smirked. You think I didn't expect you to dig that up? Every great reformer needs a villain. And I played my part perfectly. That line stopped me. The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the camera equipment. What do you mean? I asked slowly. He leaned closer to his webcam, eyes glinting. Do you really think your story went viral on its own? That your little crusade became national news by accident? I made sure people saw it, Pierce. I fed it to journalists, influencers, forums. I built your fame because I knew once the world was watching, you'd overreach. And when you did, you'd become the monster they'd want to destroy. My stomach dropped. I wanted to deny it, but deep down, I knew there was a grain of truth. Martin was manipulative enough to do something like that. To build a trap out of attention itself. He continued. You see, you didn't kill the HOA movement. You revived it. Every board in America is now doubling down, tightening rules, cracking down on troublemakers. You've made me more useful than I ever was as a president. I'm their consultant now, the man who teaches them how to stop people like you. The comments went berserk. This is insane. He's confessing. You can't make this up. I stared at the screen, the calm in my voice returning like ice. So that's your grand plan. Turn fear into your business model? You'll just keep rebuilding what you broke, as long as someone's willing to pay you to do it. He smiled thinly. That's the world, my friend. You fight corruption. I monetize it. That's balance. For a moment, it felt like everything around me blurred. But then I realized this was the moment, the final play, the one he didn't see coming. Because while Martin had been talking, The broadcast team had been recording everything. Not just the live feed, but the back-end data, the IP, the routing. And guess what? Rick was already tracing it. I nodded subtly to him. He gave me a small thumbs up. I looked back at Martin. "You've made one mistake," I said quietly. "You always think you're the smartest man in the room, but sometimes the room's recording." His smirk faltered. "What are you—" Before he could finish, Rick switched the screen share. On the live stream, viewers could see the back-end dashboard with the tracing data. Martin's location was broadcasting from a commercial. Address registered to Caldwell Consulting, LLC, funded by 3 HOA boards, currently under federal investigation for financial misconduct. The chat exploded like fireworks. "He's done. Exposed live. This is insane." Martin's face froze. The feed flickered, then went black. Disconnected. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then I exhaled slowly and looked back at the camera. "Sometimes," I said, "you don't have to demolish the house to take away its power. You just have to turn the lights on." The comments filled with applause emojis, clapping gifs, and words of support. Within an hour, the clip was everywhere, trending on social media, analyzed by journalists, discussed on talk shows. By that evening, 3 separate HOA boards had issued public statements distancing themselves from Martin. The next morning, a state investigator announced they were reviewing his consulting business for fraud and interference. I didn't feel joy, exactly. More like relief. It was finally over. The game he'd been playing in the shadows had been dragged, kicking and screaming, into the daylight. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. Martin might have lost this round, but men like him don't just disappear. They reinvent themselves. Still, for the first time in a long time, Maple Ridge felt quiet, peaceful, honest, and I intended to keep it that way. The next few days were a blur. My phone never stopped buzzing. News outlets wanted interviews. Podcasts wanted exclusives. And social media was flooded with clips from the live town hall. The moment Martin got exposed, the look on his face, right before the feed cut out, became an instant meme. People were calling it the HOA mic drop. But fame, even when it's righteous, has its own kind of price. At first, the messages were overwhelmingly supportive. People thanked me for standing up to corruption, for proving that homeowners had rights too. But mixed in with the praise came the hate. Organized, relentless hate. Anonymous accounts flooded my pages. Some accused me of faking the entire feud for clout. Others claimed I'd ruined community harmony and destroyed the image of homeowners associations nationwide. A few even sent veiled threats. "Enjoy your lake house while you can." Rick told me to ignore it. "They're just noise," he said. "You beat Martin. He's done." But I wasn't so sure, because even when you cut off a snake's head, sometimes it still twitches. That week, federal investigators opened an inquiry into Caldwell Consulting, LLC. The findings came fast. Illegal kickbacks, false contracts, and fraudulent consulting reports for over a dozen HOAs across 3 states. Martin's name was on every one of them. He'd been laundering HOA funds through dummy shell companies. When the news broke, it was over. Officially, Martin Caldwell was arrested for fraud and embezzlement. His mugshot was plastered everywhere. The once perfect HOA president, now looking like a man who'd been cornered by his own reflection. I should have felt triumphant, and part of me did, but there was also this strange emptiness. Like the fight that had defined me for so long had suddenly vanished, leaving a silence I didn't know how to fill. The Open Gate initiative was thriving. New communities were forming around the country. HOA-free neighborhoods, built on fairness and mutual respect. I got invited to speak at a real estate convention in Denver. The crowd was massive. developers, homeowners, city planners. All hungry for a new model. As I stood on that stage, looking out over the audience, I realized how far things had come. I told them the truth, that I hadn't set out to start a movement. I just wanted to protect what was mine. But sometimes, justice for one person opens the door for thousands of others. Afterward, a woman approached me backstage. She was in her 50s, professional, calm. "You don't know me," she said, "but I was one of Martin's clients." My guard went up immediately. "I didn't know what he was doing," she said quickly. "None of us did. He convinced us we were protecting our communities. But after what you exposed, I resigned from my board. I'm starting over," I nodded. "That's all anyone can do. Start over." She hesitated, then added, "You know, for what it's worth. He hated you, but he respected you." I smiled faintly. That's exactly what made him dangerous. When I returned home, the cabin felt different. The lake reflected the soft gold of evening, and the wind carried the quiet hum of peace. The kind I hadn't felt since before that first HOA letter ever hit my doorstep. I thought maybe, finally, it was done. But that night, as I sat on my porch, something caught my eye. Across the lake, on the far side of the shoreline, where the forest thickened, a single light flickered on. It wasn't a house light. It was small, moving. A lantern, maybe. I stood up frowning. Nobody lived over there. That land was technically mine, part of the buffer I'd bought years ago. I watched the light bulb slowly, then vanish into the trees. Probably nothing. Maybe some hikers, maybe kids. Still, I made a note to check it out in the morning. When I went inside, I found a letter sitting on my kitchen counter. Not in the mailbox. On the counter. I froze. The cabin was locked. I hadn't seen anyone come in. My hand trembled as I picked it up. Plain white envelope. No postage. Just one word written in block letters. Finale. Inside, a single piece of paper. Printed neatly. No handwriting. "You won the battle, but the war isn't over. There are more of us than you think. No name, no clue, no signature. Just like the first letter." I sat there for a long time, staring at it. Maybe it was some copycat trying to stir me up. Someone who wanted to feel important by keeping the legend alive. But deep down, something told me it wasn't random. Because when I flipped the paper over, there was a faint watermark. A logo barely visible under the light. It was a small circular emblem, one I recognized immediately. The Caldwell Consulting insignia. Except now, the words had changed. Around the edge, it read, "The Order of the Neighborhoods." It sent a chill straight down my spine. I walked outside again and looked across the lake. The water was still, black and endless. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I saw that faint flicker of light again. But when I blinked, it was gone. Martin was behind bars. His company dissolved, but something else was growing in his place. Something quieter, bigger, and harder to see. Maybe he'd been right all along. Maybe I'd started something I couldn't control. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about one HOA anymore. It was about every place where power hides behind fences, paperwork, and fake smiles. The story wasn't ending. It was evolving. And as I stood on that porch, the cool night air brushing against my face, I knew one thing for certain. Peace was never permanent when people like Martin had disciples. The next chapter wasn't going to be about revenge. It was going to be about resistance. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, the envelope from the night before still on the counter. The words, "The Order of the Neighborhoods," burned in my mind. Whoever sent it wasn't playing games anymore. This wasn't Martin acting alone. This was a network, a quiet, well-organized underground of HOA operatives who had learned from his methods and were now coordinating in the shadows. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and studied the paper again. The emblem looked innocuous at first glance. A small circle, geometric, almost like a community seal. But under careful inspection, I noticed a faint pattern, a map of multiple counties, connected by thin lines. Whoever made this wanted me to know they were widespread. Rick arrived within the hour. "You look like hell," he said, carrying his laptop. "And judging by the look on your face, something tells me it's worse than I thought." I handed him the letter. His eyebrows shot up. "You're not kidding. This is coordinated. If they're calling themselves an order, that's a step beyond your usual HOA feud. This is almost cult-like in structure." We spent the day tracing any links we could. Shell companies, domain registrations, prior HOA litigation. Everything pointed to a network of boards operating in unison, sharing tactics, personnel, and even legal loopholes. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were teaching each other how to enforce them more efficiently. I realized then, Martin's defeat had only delayed their growth. This network had learned from him, perfected his methods, and had now gone silent until I provoked them with the viral story. But I didn't panic. I didn't run. I'd learned how to fight shadows. And I'd learned one thing above all. The truth is the weapon they can't touch. So I decided to turn the tables. I used my new platform, the Open Gate Initiative, and created an anonymous tip line, an online resource for homeowners everywhere. People could report abuses, upload documents, and expose corrupt boards without fear. The message was clear. Knowledge is power, and transparency is unstoppable. Within days, dozens of tip submissions poured in. We exposed fake fines, embezzlement, and even fraudulent eviction notices. The press picked up the story. Local authorities investigated. Social media amplified each exposure. The network that had thrived in darkness was being dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. Then, the climax. One afternoon, I received a call from a journalist who had investigated one of the most prominent boards in the network. "We've traced a payment trail," she said, "that connects multiple HOAs, including the ones in your envelope. It's massive." I leaned back, adrenaline surging. "Do you think we can take it public?" "Yes," she said. "But it has to be coordinated. If we release everything at once, we'll trigger a domino effect. Every corrupt board in the country will be exposed simultaneously." I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. "Then that's exactly what we're going to do." We launched the report at midnight. Every newsroom, every online outlet, every social platform lit up. The order of the neighborhoods, Martin's legacy, and now their silent successors, was exposed. Boards were dissolved, administrators removed, lawsuits filed. The story went viral, and for the first time, people realized the scale of what had been happening under the guise of community governance. The world was watching. HOAs across the nation scrambled to respond. But this time, they weren't operating in shadows. Transparency had the upper hand. Back at my cabin, I watched the sun set over the lake. The sky painted in shades of orange and gold. The water reflected a calm I hadn't felt in months. I sipped my coffee, smiling quietly. Justice, I realized, doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from patience, preparation, and the courage to expose the truth. Martin had started the chaos, but I had turned it into something lasting. The cabin remained standing. The lake remained mine. The community around it was no longer controlled by fear. And even though the order may have had disciples lurking somewhere, the game had changed forever. As I looked out over the water, I understood one final truth. Battles end, but lessons endure. And the lesson I'd learned and shared was simple. Power thrives in silence, but truth thrives in the light. I smiled and poured myself another cup of coffee. The world felt quiet, for now, and this time I was ready for whatever came next. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you in the next one. Goodbye.